From Vassar College, this is Conversations at the Salt Line with Wesley Dixon. On this episode, a conversation with Naomi Seligman.
Hello everyone, it's me, Wes, and welcome to another episode of Conversations at the Salt Line. Today, I'm excited to welcome Vassar alum Naomi Seligman von Simson, class of 55, to the podcast and back to campus. Thank you for being here, Naomi.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.
It's been a delight.
Oh, wonderful. So I'm going to ask you why you're on campus in a minute, but I have to say you are a first on our podcast series, and I'm curious if you can anticipate what the first thing that you are is.
What the first thing?
Yeah, like you're a first. You're the first of something on this podcast. And
well,
I'm wondering,
surely the first of my class, because I'm a relic and there's nobody else around.
Yes.
I don't know what else.
Yeah, well, you kind of got it. The first is much broader. You're the first guest who is a Vassar grad who went to Vassar wholly when it was single-sex education at all women's college.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about that.
Okay.
This is a new experience for me. And so I'm curious, what was it like to be at Vassar at that time, particularly when it was an all-women's college?
Well, first of all, I went in part because it was an all-women's college.
Okay.
I grew up in a house full of 4 brothers. They were a damn nuisance.
Were you their older sister or they were your older?
I'm the oldest.
Okay, wow. You can't
and my mother was saving the world, so I wasn't around very much. She wasn't around very much. And my brothers did things that young boys do. And so I loved libraries. I loved getting away from the brothers.
Yeah.
My mother's idea of the only college you could possibly go to was a Seven Sisters school.
Okay.
And her idea further was it was going to be Bryn Mawr or Radcliffe, which I didn't want to do. She liked them because they were good at languages.
Okay.
I went to Vassar and fell in love. But I also wanted the experience, and I knew it instinctively, of being taught or being surrounded by strong-minded, competent women. Mm-hmm. My mother and grandmother had been that, but I really didn't see women in my household or in the co-ed school I'd gone to before. So going to an all-girls school was an enormous pleasure for me. We didn't have to put lipstick on in the morning, which otherwise you did. You didn't have to look good in class for some guy. It was a great relief, and I had exactly the experience I hoped for of seeing strong, competent women very comfortable with themselves in this environment.
It's amazing. So I am curious then, and we just mentioned this before we started recording a little bit, what your reaction was after you graduated and you were out in the world living your life and you heard through the transom that Vassar was becoming a co-educational institution. What was your reaction? What were your immediate thoughts about it?
Well, like Admiral Hopper, I was not in favor of it. I thought, I have a different feeling today after all these years, but I thought it would take away some of the strengths that Vassar had. I was wrong.
Yeah. What? When did you know you were wrong? At what point did you recognize, oh, this might have been a good thing?
Yesterday.
It took so many years.
Well, I didn't come back. I didn't, I retained my prejudice.
Yes. Well, so tell me, and I know, but the listeners don't know, why did you come back to campus this weekend?
I came back to campus to honor Admiral Grace Hopper. She had been a mentor to me. She would never call herself that, partly because she didn't use such language, but she was surely a very great mentor to me. And I'm one of the few people around who can talk about the complexities of who she was.
Yeah. We're going to get into your relationship with her in a little bit, but I just want to go back briefly to your time at Vassar. And I heard you recently talk about your studies at Vassar, and I believe you studied history and economics.
That's correct.
And in particular, I heard you talk about a class on revolutions. So I'd love to hear about that class and what stuck out to you from that class.
So the senior seminars, so to explain, I spent 2 years, then I went for my junior year abroad, which was very disorganized in those days.
Where'd you go?
Well, it's a little complicated, but it was in England.
Okay.
And my tutor left the second week of the term, and in the English system where everything depends on your tutor, they said, "Do you want another tutor?" And I said, "Not particularly." So I spent the year touring Europe and had a wonderful time. Didn't study anything. Came back to a double major and really had to work.
Yeah.
And I worked. And Vassar had wonderful senior seminars, and I think it still does from what I've learned.
Yeah.
There was a senior seminar on the fever chart, as it's called, of revolutions, because revolutions follow a pattern. And I was lucky enough to be taught in that class. There were 8 of us in the senior seminar, lovely small class. 2 of them are still very close friends of mine.
Oh, wow.
But the point is, the class taught us about how revolutions follow a pattern.
Yeah.
And from that, I learned about pattern recognition.
Yeah.
And pattern recognition is a very important thing to understand, kind of for the rest of your life,
Yeah.
because it's a very useful skill that only grows with time.
Yeah, absolutely. On the topic of revolutions, I don't want to imply that we are having one now in this country, although it is a
Oh, we
turbulent
are.
time. So this is my question. My question is actually regressive first. I wanted to hear if there was a particular moment in history or revolution that you remember from that class that you were like, wow, that is a really memorable thing to have learned about in this way.
Well, the French Revolution, which, like all revolutions, started as a middle-class revolution, turned into a rabble, turned into, afterwards, a rather terrible autocracy, cutting off people's heads and all that sort of thing. And then chaos, and then a return to a monarchy. And it's when a revolution gets spent. And I fear that right now we're in some of the fever chart stages of a revolution.
Yeah. And so that given that and given your assessment part of the class, what are the anticipated next milestones of
They're all bad. They're all bad.
But at some point it gets better.
It can take many years,
Yeah.
and that's what terrifies me.
Yeah. You've studied revolutions in this way as you described, but you've also lived a very long life. And so you've seen sort of cycles of society and cycles of life. And so I am curious, given what you just said about it's going to get worse, what keeps you hopeful? What keeps you looking forward to life in these moments, given your knowledge of how the world works?
Well, first, I'm not terribly hopeful.
Okay.
But I think American history has shown resilience over time. I think historically our immigrant population has been a huge strength for the United States. We still have almost replacement rate, and with our immigrant population, we have replacement rate demographically. Which no country on earth does, even sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
And that will be a strength long term. Do I see any strengths in the current political scene? No.
Yeah. I appreciate your honesty. Thank you for that. I do want to circle back to the reason that you're here,
Yes.
Which is Admiral Grace Hopper. And believe it or not, I'm sure some people listening may not know who Grace Hopper is. And so from someone who knew her and had a deep relationship with her, I'd love for you to describe as a baseline who Grace Hopper was.
She was a very great mathematician. There were no computer people in those days. Mathematics was as close as you could get. She taught at Vassar for 9 years. She got tired of that. World War II began. She went into the Navy. She was patriotic, as the vast majority of Americans were then. She loved the Navy. Then, because she was a great mathematician, very visibly, she was detailed to the Aiken Laboratory at Harvard, where they first built the first computer. The man who ran the Aiken Laboratory, Aiken, did not want a woman on the staff. He wanted to be me and the boys.
Yeah.
But there she was, and she was helpful not only at getting lunch, but she was the best damn mathematician there. They built, therefore, the first general-purpose computer there at the Aiken Lab at Harvard. And she was more than instrumental in doing it. Once they did it, she had the ability to publicize it. She then realized that a general-purpose language, more or less English-driven, would mean that computers could be used beyond the scientific community, and she knew it was going to be expensive, so she wanted it to be used not only by government and the scientific community, but by general industry.
Got it.
So she promoted that.
Yeah.
And she promoted it hard and did it with charisma and a certain amount of theatricality. And that is how it became not a very narrow scientific machine, but a general purpose machine.
Absolutely. I want to go back to that concept in a moment, but I do want to hear how you met Admiral Hopper.
Well, you really want to hear?
I really want to hear.
Okay. I was making one of my first speeches. I was under 30 years old. I was a panelist at a large meeting at the Waldorf. I was working for the first consulting company in automation at that point. She was the chair of the panel. I got up to speak and spoke for a few minutes, and then a man in the audience, it was dark in the very large ballroom at the Waldorf, got up and started shouting that I had ruined his life because I had fired him, which was true. It was something I'd had to do. And it was very hard for me because he was twice my age. He shouted that he had a family and children in orthodonture, et cetera, et cetera. The audience was paralyzed. I was more paralyzed, just standing there. And Admiral Hopper, she was then a captain, stood up and said, "We'll take a coffee break now." I was ready to climb under the table, of course. Everybody was not time for coffee break, but they had one. Everybody fired out to get their coffee and donuts or whatever. And she came over to me, led me out, and in the corner said, "How was I doing?" And I said, "Okay." And then her second sentence was, "You went to Vassar." And I said, "Yes, but how do
did you know that?
It, wasn't anything when she introduced me. And she said, "Your hair. You have Vassar hair." I still have that hair.
This is the hair you have today, the same one you...
Same style. And if you look at pictures of her, it's the same style. I didn't do it for that reason. All Vassar girls at that time had hair like that.
Had the same hair.
Yes. And she was right. And then she asked me some things about myself.
Yeah.
I don't think she met that many women at that time. I represented, in a sense, large corporations. And she wanted computers to go into large corporations.
Yeah.
So we had a natural affinity for each other, although at the time she was already highly regarded and famous, and I was a little pipsqueak.
Yeah. You said earlier that you don't know that Admiral Hopper would have used the descriptor as her mentor to you because she wouldn't have used that language. But I am curious, despite the language, do you think she felt a mentor-mentee relationship with you? Or how do you think she understood
Well,
your
I know she
relationship?
did,
Okay.
because not only me, and she mentored her ensigns, and they adored her in the Pentagon. The Navy was the first major users of computers in the military or anywhere else, and that was because she promoted it. And she had a handful of ensigns who went through her programs in the Pentagon, and they just adored her. There was a certain amount of snickering about working for a woman,
Yeah.
and didn't bother them at all, didn't bother her at all. And she was mentoring them as she mentored me. So yes, she very much had that mentality.
Yeah.
But she didn't do it by lecturing you and telling you what you should learn. She did it by behaving in certain ways herself and expecting you to notice it.
Yeah.
And she could be critical.
Yeah.
She was critical of my impatience.
Yeah. Was there a moment, people I think sometimes think of mentor-mentee relationships as harmony, right? There's this, people are drawn to each other, they have affinity to each other. But from my own experience, there are times when your mentor can be tough on you, and it can be a really rough experience. It's not always very rosy. So you mentioned partly, thematically, she was critical of your impatience. And so I'm curious if there was a moment where you remember crying or being hurt or being like, wow, does she really love me? She's so hard on me.
There were two times. One time was when I went to visit her in the Pentagon about leaving my company and becoming an entrepreneur. And I was nervous about doing it. I thought I had a very good job. I was proud of myself and the perks I had and what I thought I'd accomplished. And she told me that she would be ashamed of me if I didn't go back immediately and resign. And I took the train back to New York, and I felt smaller the entire way, and I'm pretty small, and she was pretty small. I felt ashamed that I didn't see what she saw, that I was not willing to take a chance. And she had taken so many chances. And I felt very ashamed. There was another time after her 22 years in the Navy, and this came out the way I hoped it would come out. And then she disappeared. She just disappeared. She was ill and dying, but she handled it by just disappearing. And I sat down and wrote her a long letter, very careful letter, about what she had meant to me. And those days we still wrote letters. I never heard from her. And I rarely had the temerity to call her up. But I thought, well, the post office doesn't work very well. It still doesn't work very well. It stopped working altogether. But in those days, you kind of counted on it. And I wanted her to have the letter. And so finally, I pulled myself together at what I thought was a good time of day. And I called her up and I asked her if she'd received the letter. And she said, "Of course I did, Naomi." And I felt so badly that I had bothered to do that.
Her, yeah.
Because I realized she didn't want, she didn't want to feel like people were writing her eulogy at that moment. She was such a strong person. She wanted us to remember her as she was, in full admiral regalia, on a stage, explaining technology to people who didn't understand it. And she didn't want anybody to know frailty. And I stupidly tapped into that. So, yes, I felt terrible.
I don't know. Of course, it's your experience. I don't know if it's a stupid thing to have tapped into, because in some ways, it seems to me that you are actually giving her the benefit of humanity by recognizing the frailty, as opposed to her having to live up to this triumphant superwoman, superhero persona, which is hard to maintain, I imagine.
That's who That's who she became.
Yeah.
And Superwoman did not mean that she wasn't kind.
Okay.
She was very kind. But in the military fashion,
Sure.
you were physically together all the time.
Yeah.
And so the physical frailty was not acceptable.
Was not, yeah. The concept of mentorship, I think, is so important. You've experienced it, obviously, in the ways you've described. And one thing that I'm curious about is you talked about what you've, in part, taken from Grace, if you will. But I am curious if there are things that you learned from Grace or saw in Grace that you let go. That is to say, there are things you learned by watching Grace that you were like, I'm not going to do that, or Grace isn't good at this, or I don't like the way that she's done this. And so my learning is going to be that I'm going to not take that part of her with me.
It's an interesting question. The answer is 90% no.
Okay.
Everything I learned from her, which mostly was from observation, some of it I couldn't take.
Okay.
But what I could take, I very much learned from. I didn't do it. I didn't do anything the way she did it.
Okay.
But I took those lessons, generalized them, and used them
Applied
for
them
myself.
to yourself. Yeah.
I adopted them to myself.
Yeah.
And there's nothing I think that I wouldn't have taken. She left parts of her life behind. I have not done that.
This
That's
is what I was getting at, or part what I was trying to get at. That's so interesting. And now you've had a full career, and I do want to talk about it because I don't want to sort of see you only through the lens of your relationship to Grace. Obviously, your own person. And so I assume, mentored many people. And so I'm curious how you are as a mentor and the way that you approach mentorship to younger people.
I don't think I've done it as successfully as she did. She was used to military chain of command, and she liked the military chain of command. So there were formal ways that you did that.
Right.
In the business world, that's much less true.
Okay.
I know many people, not just women, men too, that feel I've mentored them. I'm not so aware of that myself.
Okay.
I had an interesting experience the other day.
Tell me.
A friend of mine, a male friend, who was the number 2 at a huge insurance company, and he lost out for the CEO job, retired, has done things that retired people do. And I was talking to him one day about 8-9 months ago. I said, well, how are things? He said, well, it's fine. I'm serving on these boards, and the children all live in different parts of the world, but I have a good relationship with the grandchildren. He's burbling along. I said, well, how are you really? He said, I'm lonely. And I said, why are you lonely? He said, well, this doesn't fill up my life the way the job did. And business relationships are transactional. You lose them. And he said, I'm lonely. I said, you don't reach out to people. Men don't as much reach out to people. They don't network so much.
Yeah.
Well, now he reaches out to me endlessly. I never have a minute to myself. But he just wasn't aware of it.
Yeah.
But usually what mentoring I've done, it's not by telling people things.
Sure.
I've observed that about men. They don't tend to network as much. They don't tell their real friends the truth as much. That's a huge generalization. I apologize for it.
No, I understand.
But I have found myself saying that to men.
It's funny. There was an article in a podcast related to the article maybe a year ago about this very concept, in particular, men of a certain generation.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes, it's more true.
feeling like they have friendships, but when you ask them about the nature of those relationships, they're actually not really friendships in a full, robust way. They're sort of more convenient, more
They're
surface. They're transactional, right? And those men, to your point, sort of they're in this dissonant place because they feel like I have these buddies, people that I talk to, but the actual feeling is of emptiness, right? And it's
Right.
confusing because they can't understand those two things together.
Right.
And so I think it's a very true thing you're hitting on as well. So you, as you mentioned earlier, have been and are your own entrepreneur.
Yes.
You've done incredible things in business. And I'm just curious, besides Grace sort of belittling you or making you feel small, how was the leap going into entrepreneurship after having worked in the business world?
Well, yesterday I was asked a question about shouldn't everybody be an entrepreneur? And the answer to that is no.
Correct.
And not everybody has an entrepreneurial.
There's tons of failed businesses out there.
Right. 8 out of 10.
Right.
Startups. How did I feel? For the first 3 years, which is a long time, I kept wondering why I didn't have a nice, safe job in a bank somewhere where I thought I would have done reasonably well and
Yeah.
actually gotten a regular paycheck, as opposed to having the IRS as our first investor. So how did I feel about it?
Yeah.
I was scared.
Yeah.
Our first year was okay. We knew it was a startup, so we expected that. The second year was terrible.
Yeah.
The third year, we began to succeed. We were weirdly lucky enough not to raise any money in advance. So nobody had any ownership.
Right.
And that gave us a freedom that was terribly important.
Yeah.
But it was also scary.
I know the answer, but just for those listening, who is the we in your statement?
It was my first professional partner and then my husband, and we've been life partners. We have 4 grown children and grandchildren.
Wonderful.
And we always worked in separate facilities because our skills are very, very different. What makes a partnership possible is respect and trust, and we both always had that.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier sort of the 3-year time period to become successful, and I'm just curious what success meant in that business. How did you sort of know? What was the indicator that you were sort of at a decent place?
Well, one of the most critical ways is revenue,
Right,
so
of
you
course.
can pay your bills.
Yes.
That's probably the most critical. But we also knew that our idea of what we wanted to do was correct because we were beginning to build a unique reputation.
Yeah.
And that unique reputation lasted for 50 years.
Wow.
And by then, we knew what we were doing was going to work.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And I think it's very hard for an entrepreneur to know it's going to work. They go into it because they're sure it's going to work.
Yeah.
And then they discover having the best product doesn't necessarily work.
Right.
Having friends doesn't necessarily work. Having a few customers doesn't necessarily work.
Right.
And all the things you thought when you started don't necessarily work.
Right.
But by the third year, we knew not only that the idea was a winner, but that we could deliver
You could
on
actually
it,
execute on it.
and it was sustainable.
Yeah. The longevity point that you mentioned of the 50-year unique sort of idea, I want to come back to, but I do want to circle back to the freedom that you were afforded by having been self-funded, basically, and not sort of invested in at that point in time. What explicitly did that freedom allow you to do that you would not have been able to do had you been invested in by others and sort of beholden to those in certain ways?
Well, depending on what you want to do as an entrepreneur, you either absolutely need investment.
Sure.
So if you're going to make a physical product, if you're going into chip design, you damn well need investors. Most people start with angel investors, and angel investors are unfortunately your uncle or your dentist or people like that. They don't understand investing in something entrepreneurial, so they get very scared very early on. Oh my God, I'm actually going to lose this money. The odds are that they are. So they start poking around and interfering and telling you should do this, that, and the other thing. If you survive that stage, then you get venture capital money. And the venture capitalists really think they own you. They're there to watch you have a great rise and then get out. And in the early days of venture capital, there were people who understood the business you are in.
Sure.
In today's venture capital world, they don't necessarily understand the business at all. So they not only make suggestions, but they can enforce them by their funding of what you should do here or there that they learned about in business school.
On YouTube, right?
And it can be disastrous, and you can spend all your time managing them. And they can put you out of business or keep you in business.
Wow. You mentioned that you realized at year 3 that your idea was unique and successful and ultimately ended up lasting for 50 years. And so the longevity, of course, is very impressive because that's something
both companies are still going.
So
the first one we formed,
plus.
They still exist.
Incredible. So with that, obviously, the company has seen and weathered a variety of different periods of technological and innovative growth in this country and in the world. And I'm just curious how you would describe the different sort of periods of time in terms of technological advancement and innovation, and then also think about and tell us how your companies survived and thrived given those changing landscapes.
So I've seen 4 waves of technology. I think we're in the 5th in the AI revolution.
Okay.
They do have a pattern. I referred to patterns earlier. It's what I mentioned. It's called the boom, bust, build cycle. They have a boom period. That's where we've been in the AI cycle now. Everything's wonderful. It's going to solve all the world problems. Everybody's going to be put out of work. Maybe there'll be new jobs. Maybe there won't be new jobs. But it's going to solve all the world's problems.
Yeah.
And that's the boom cycle. The stock market's crazy. The valuations are insane.
Yeah.
Everybody's a billionaire overnight until the bust cycle. Because the entrepreneur usually believes it, so they don't sell a lot of stock. Sometimes they do, but usually they don't. And the bust cycle is, oh my God, it didn't work the way we thought. The world's coming to an end. It's not a great technology. Valuations decline. Customers don't just do crazy things with it because it's hot.
Right.
And it all evaporates. Most of the companies then disappear. The build cycle is long. You find a lot of utility for the products.
Yeah.
There's a reluctance to use them seriously in the commercial world in some areas, and huge acceptance in other areas, but most of it moves slower than anybody expects. And it's sustainable, and it's sticky, and you live through it.
Wow.
What's different today is the structure of technology industries have changed. We have, in the United States, same ones apply to Europe, 4 what are called hyperscalers, Google, Meta, Amazon. Well, we have Apple too, but Google, Meta, Amazon, and who am I missing? Oh, Microsoft, of course. And they are so dominant and have so much money that if new products or ideas come along and they're threatening to those companies, they just buy them.
Buy them up.
They buy them up.
Yeah. And so did you say
So you have an oligopoly.
Right.
And you didn't in any of the
previous
ways.
time? You mentioned, of course, that we're at the beginning of the fifth technological revolution with AI. And I didn't know if you said that, if you were implying that we were at the beginning of the three boom bust build because we're just starting this fifth one. It seemed to me like as you described it, we might be in the build cycle of AI.
No, we're
but
not in the build
That's why I
cycle.
wanted to ask. Okay, so you think we're
just
in the
entering the
boom?
bust
Oh, we're
cycle.
entering the bust cycle. Okay. Well, it's funny. The reason why I thought we were at the build because we talk, or at least as a regular person in the world, I'm experiencing, to your point, the uptake of AI in all kinds of different dimensions, right? And the reticence of it as well that you described that happens in the build cycle. So it felt like we were in that cycle where some were really leaning in fully and they're like applying it broadly, and others who are like, I can't even touch it because it's so scary, but I'm too early, I'm too far along. We're really just we're just early on.
Because that's associated partly with the financial markets,
Okay.
which at first will fund anything.
Okay.
And then they say, oh, it's a hula hoop, it's nothing, and they won't fund anything.
Right.
So they go from one end of the boat to the other.
It's a pendulum spectral. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. I know we're short on time, but I do want to just touch on the idea of genius and brilliance. You mentioned this yesterday at your talk at the Institute, and there were several people who you highlighted as geniuses and things about them that, from your perspective, made them geniuses. And there are some who I thought would fall in that category who didn't. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So just conceptually, how do you think about genius and brilliance, and what are the differences between the two?
Brilliance is usually a combination, I think, and nobody's ever asked me this, so I'm not sure my answer is very complete. Brilliance, I think, is a combination of high IQ, enormous determination, doggedness, discipline, a whole lot of other things.
Sure.
Seeing something and doing it.
Okay.
And that's it.
I see.
They tend not to see around corners. Very high intelligence, but not necessarily seeing anything that doesn't exist.
Visionary or anticipatory or things like that.
Yeah.
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 And then geniuses are those things plus the ability.
Geniuses see around corners.
Yeah.
They see things that normal people don't see, and they're almost real to them. They don't exist, but they're almost real. And then they work on making them real.
Well, I was just going to say, I wonder if really, if not the difference, but the nuance might be that the genius sort of sees what may not exist at all, but they, because of the tenets described in the brilliance, start to will it into existence, right?
They always
just make
will it into
yeah.
existence. They therefore do things that are on the margin of the law all the time. I was in a car once with Steve Jobs, and he parked, and there was a huge sign, "No parking here." And I said, "Steve, I don't think we can park here." He said, "I can park here." And it wasn't anything special.
Right.
He just didn't
It's just
think
a way of
the
life, a way of
rules
thinking.
apply.
Yeah.
So I think he has a completely despicable behavior pattern and personality, but I think that Elon Musk is a genius. He saw around a corner to make an electric car.
Yeah.
He saw to do a satellite company,
Yeah.
which NASA somehow couldn't get their act together to do. That's someone who sees around corners.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he's a wonderful example of a genius not being a very human person.
Yeah.
And he's not. Does he do things that are at the edge of the law or not even the law?
Sure.
Yes, I think a lot of geniuses
Yeah.
are like that. And there are not a lot of geniuses.
Yeah.
Larry Ellison, who's the founder of Oracle, and I'm on the Oracle board of directors, is a genius. And I once said something to Larry, and he said, "Well, Naomi, I have 10 ideas a minute." And I said, "Yeah, 3 of them are good." And he said, "That many?" And it didn't bother him at all.
Yeah, exactly. There was no pride of authorship, if you will.
Yeah, but nobody else had 10 ideas a minute.
Right.
They didn't even have one. Because all 10 were unorthodox.
Yeah.
And he was very happy
was
with the
happy
idea
about
that
that.
3 of them were good.
I just want to tie something together from our talk about Grace earlier. You mentioned that Grace sort of had deep and incredible brilliance relative to her technical skill, but also had sort of the charisma and sort of, you didn't say this, but sort of the humanity alongside that to really create this magic where she had the influence that she had because of the combination of those two things. I'm reminded of that as you're talking about Elon Musk, right? Sort of having this sort of genius and this brilliance, but not, you didn't say it this way, but not having maybe the charisma or the humanity to accompany that sort of genius, right? And so it makes me feel like the combination of those things is what also made Grace so special to you because she demonstrated.
Well, she was so human.
Yes, exactly.
With it.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's very well said.
Yeah.
She was so human with it.
Yeah.
I mean, geniuses are very rare.
Yeah.
I think what surprised me is usually they're very chameleon, too. So Steve Jobs was totally chameleon.
Yeah.
There was a large book written which described him as a very difficult person, screaming at employees, that sort of thing. The book bothered me very much. I know the author a little. And I said, that wasn't the Steve Jobs
That
I
I
knew.
knew.
And it wasn't. I never saw him behave the way it was described in the book.
Yeah.
I was walking up a street with Steve Jobs once. We'd left a party and he asked me to take a walk with him. And there was a poor soul sitting on the street with a hat out, University Avenue in Palo Alto.
Okay.
And Steve took a wad of money out of his jeans, put it in the hat. We walked 2 blocks further, and I said, Steve, I've got to go back to the party. He said, okay, I've got to go home. But I don't have a car. Do you have any money so I can get a cab? Because he had taken this whole wad, and
Right.
he didn't carry credit cards. And that was Steve. I didn't see the person described
Right.
in this book.
Right.
And I think these people often have a chameleon kind of personality.
Yeah.
You know.
That makes sense. We're close to time, so I do want to go to our student hot seat questions. But the last thing I wanted to do before we did that was I heard you mention yesterday your experience when you were being voted on for your first Silicon Valley corporate board. And there was a moment when you came back in the room in terms of what people were saying to you about that. And I thought it was very moving. So I wanted you just to recount that story and then we can talk
Sure.
about it for a few minutes
Sure.
before we leave.
I was young. It was my first Silicon Valley board invitation. It had a lot of eminent people on the board. It was held in a big boardroom, and before I was supposed to enter the room, they had to have a formal vote. They had all my background and information before that, but they had to have a formal vote.
Right.
So I was told to stand outside the room, which I did. And then I was called into the room. And when I was called in, I looked at this long table, I have to say all full of men except one. And they took one look at me, and one of the men, who was obviously important in the room, turned around and said, "We don't need any coffee right now." And I just stood there frozen and then took my seat.
Well, so it's such a funny story because in today's world, you know, they would call that a microaggression. They might have called it that then too, I don't know. But we call it a microaggression in today's world. But obviously when you told the story,
It wasn't very micro.
Right. It was quite direct. But it didn't seem to, well, I don't know, you can tell me. It didn't seem to bother you or it didn't change how you acted in that space.
No.
Right? Which is so funny because we have a lot of conversation now about these kinds of micro or macroaggressions, and people, for various reasons, understandable, of course, have strong reactions to these kinds of things, right? But obviously that was not.
Well, that was one of the things I learned from Admiral Hopper. You just put one foot in front of the other
You just keep going.
and keep going.
Don't let it
And
distract
I also
you.
learned that from growing up in a household of boys.
Of all these men who were nuisances, as you said.
So
this is another
I
nuisance man
think
to you.
I was, in a way, lucky
Yeah.
enough to have both of those experiences.
Yeah.
And I have a friend who was one of the early women on
You're
the stock
popular.
exchange. And she said, I said, how did you handle that? It's such a macho environment. She said, I wore a short skirt and kept trading. Well, none of the young women I know today would say that.
Exactly.
But it worked.
It worked for her.
Yeah.
Let's do these 3 questions so we can
Yes,
be out on
of course.
time, okay? So the first question is, what innovation over the last 70 years or so were you most skeptical of at first?
This is embarrassing. It was when Steve Jobs first showed us a personal computer, and I said, what are people going to do with that? And he said, I want normal people to have a computer. Normal people can't have a computer. Of course, we all have it on our iPhones today. He said, and I said, but still, what are they going to do with it? He said, women are going to do recipes in their kitchen, and it's going to play music. I said, that's ridiculous.
And now it does all that. Plus,
I was
plus, plus,
completely
plus, plus.
wrong. Now, he showed us a computer playing music.
Yeah.
It didn't actually work, but it was a good fake.
Wonderful. The next question is actually kind of related. It is, what is your most memorable mistake in business?
I don't think I want to tell you.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, well, if you can't tell me what it is, can you tell me why you don't want to tell me?
It was, I don't even know if it was a mistake.
Okay.
We all the time had clients come to us and say, so I'm telling you,
I know, yeah.
that we didn't charge enough money. And we never charged more. So I would have been richer, but so what?
But you're fine with that.
I'm fine.
Yeah. Third question, last question. How has it been having your husband as your life partner and your business partner?
Difficult, demanding, but I said earlier, we've always had mutual respect and mutual trust. We have very different talents, which you'd better have. If you're going to be an entrepreneur, it's great to have a partner.
Yeah.
And it's great if you have different talents. But if you have different talents, you see things very differently.
Yeah.
And that means if you're both strong characters, you're going to argue. And you're going to argue a lot. And then you go home and have dinner with the children. So
Wonderful.
it's not easy, but it's also enriching.
Yeah.
We have members of the family where one's a doctor and the other is in real estate.
Yeah.
And they can't talk about their days because the one doesn't understand the other and they don't care.
Yeah.
And I feel sad for them.
And it has not been your experience, obviously.
That's not been our experience.
It's wonderful.
And we still talk about the industry all the time.
It's beautiful.
We both sit on boards and we discuss the discussions on our boards in a way that neither of us can do with other people.
Right.
So,
Naomi, it's been such a pleasure and a privilege to have you here. You are a wealth of information, knowledge, wisdom, experience, and I'm grateful to have had this time with you today. I'm grateful that we can call you one of ours here at Vassar.
Thank you. I have to say, your questions were delightful. I learned from them.
Oh, that is a compliment to me, and I take it very, very meaningfully.
You deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for tuning in for another episode of Conversations at the Salt Line. We'll talk to you soon. Have a good one.